I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today we're having a look at two different choices from the medium SUV segment. A name that a lot of people will know, the Honda CR-V, a car that's been in Australia for about 20 years, and also a new badge in the form of the Holden Equinox. Although this car will be instantly familiar to many of our overseas viewers, especially people from the Americas where it's known as the Chevrolet Equinox. That said, it's the first time we've had an Equinox here in Australia, badged as General Motors' local brand Holden, and it's actually the first Holden to launch since that company shut up its local manufacturing operations about 3 months ago. So expectations are riding high on this Mexico-sourced SUV. Meanwhile, the CR-V is already well and truly established. It launched in an all-new model in 2017. This time it's available here in Australia with 7 seats, whereas the larger Equinox is strictly a 5-seater. The Captiva 7-seater will be replaced later in 2018 by a GMC-sourced truck called the Acadia. But when it comes to the Holden versus the Honda, how do these two stack up? If you've got somewhere between $35,000 and $45,000 and you're after a medium SUV as your next family car, should you buy the CR-V or the Equinox? Let's jump into both and start finding out. Jump up into the cabin of the Holden Equinox, and if you've driven or if you've sat in any other recent Holdens, it'll feel pretty familiar. And that's because GM are really going for a cohesive feel to the interiors of their cars. So overall, the layout of the Equinox looks pretty similar to an Astra, pretty similar to the forthcoming new Commodore, which is based on the Opel Insignia. And so there is a feeling of familiarity when you do hop up into the Equinox. However, when you dig a little bit deeper into things like the material quality, you'll find that actually it's a little bit scratchy and plasticky, and that's one thing that lets down the impression of quality from the get-go in the Equinox. However, thankfully, the hardness of the dash doesn't extend down to the seats. This Equinox LT actually has a fantastic pair of really comfortable and supportive cloth seats up front. Although they are cloth, we actually think that a good cloth seat can best a crappy leather seat any day, and this denim-like cloth is right up there with the best. So that gets a big tick, as does the soft leather steering wheel that sits in front of you. That also feels like a quality item. Another thing that feels like a decent quality item is the 8-inch touchscreen that you get on the LT, LTZ and LTZ-V models. On the lower end Equinoxes, you do get a lower res 7-inch screen, so we do recommend going for the LT or above. It comes with integrated navigation, which is always nice to have, plus Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, although the standard 6-speaker stereo could be better. Hop up to the LTZ model and that has a higher end Bose system that we think sounds pretty good. Practicality, however, in the Equinox is really impressive. There's a very deep central bin between the seats that you could even get a handbag into, 2 medium-sized cup holders here, and a deep space ahead of the shifter with 2 USB ports, which is always a nice to have in a family car, and there's even more USB ports in the back. The door bins, they're big enough for a 1-litre bottle, however they are unlined, so loose objects are allowed to scratch around, just like in the Honda. Just as the Equinox bears a strong resemblance inside to most of the current Holden lineup, so too does the CR-V in terms of the Honda range, and it follows directly in the footsteps of the new Civic's cabin, which we think is great because we really like the direction that Honda is taking their interiors in. The design is fresh and modern, but also clean and uncluttered compared to the old designs of the previous Honda CR-V and especially the previous Civic. It looks great in here. So you jump into a cabin that looks and actually feels relatively high quality for the money that you're spending. In terms of material quality, some are a little bit hard, although they're disguised as soft material. Others, like the material up here on the dashboard or on the door tops, is a little bit softer and more yielding. The steering wheel, which is leather, that feels good. The gear shift feels okay. What feels really great are these leather seats, and it's also impressive that at under 39 grand, you get heated leather seats in this car, which feel really, really lovely. In fact, the driver's seat has 12-way power adjustment, which is really, really impressive, and almost anybody will be able to find a good driving position in this car. Further afield, the infotainment is a mixed bag. The presentation is lovely. This slate looks fantastic. Honda have put a physical volume knob back in after it disappeared on the Civic. However, the software that the screen runs is not good. The integrated navigation from Garmin, bit cheap, and the way the other menus look is just not up to scratch for 2018. However, the car does have Apple CarPlay and Android Auto as standard, so it redeems some points there. And the digital gauges in front of the driver look clean and present all the important information right in your line of sight. Practicality is also excellent. Just like in the Holden, there's a really deep central cavity here, which is actually slightly open all of the time, although you can fit a bag or probably a pair of iPads in there as well. The cup holders are larger here. There's another useful tray ahead of all of this because the shifter is mounted nice and high. If you look into the bin here, there are 2 USB ports, an HDMI port, which is unusual, and then a 12-volt socket. In fact, there are 2 12-volt sockets up front here. The door bins are quite narrow. They're also unlined, which means that loose items are going to scratch around. In the back of the Equinox, the first thing you realize is that the doors open pretty wide, although not quite at a 90-degree angle, which would make it even easier to fit a child seat back here. However, in terms of carrying 5 people, the Holden Equinox is really impressive. Even though this is quite a large car, GM haven't tried to squeeze a 3rd row into it, and what that means is that the 2nd row passengers just get heaps of space. So for me at 6 foot, you can see that I've got really excellent headroom, the same for legroom and commodious tow room as well down here. You can fit a 3rd person in the middle because the floor is flat in the Holden, even if you get all-wheel drive, which is really impressive. Plus, there are some great amenities back here. So there are 2 powered USB ports across the whole range, so the kids won't have to fight to charge their iPads up front. There's also a 12-volt socket. However, if you step up to the LTZ model, you also get an Australian household power point here in the back, which is particularly awesome. However, it isn't perfect back here. The headrests, if they're in the upright position, obscure visibility from the front seat quite a bit, although you can flip them backwards. And also some of those harsh materials from up front do carry on back here, but there is a soft piece of trim on the door a little bit further back. Plus, air vents, they're standard across the whole range to keep the fresh air flowing. Have a look into the back seat of the new Honda CR-V, and the first thing you notice is just how wide the doors open. In fact, they open 90 degrees to the car, which means that fitting child seats is an absolute doddle. Close it, and you'll find that the passenger space back here is pretty decent. My legroom is absolutely enormous. However, I do have the sliding seat that you get with the 7-seat model set all the way to the back. So as you see it now, this is the setup for 5 people in the CR-V. In terms of headroom, I'm 6 foot. I've got just enough, and that's because of the panoramic sunroof. If you avoid the sunroof, you do get more headspace. However, the only 7-seater available in Australia has that roof as standard. Tow room is absolutely fine. Now, watch what happens when I slide the seat forward in order to create room for people in the 3rd row. Honestly, not too bad. I've still got enough room for my legs. I could do a couple of hours here without too much of a complaint. However, there are some other nice amenities. There's a flip down armrest with 2 cup holders, just like in the Holden. Air vents as standard, as are 2 powered USB ports that run at 2.5 amps, which is a really good charging speed for any car. And it means that your kids' iPads will stay nice and quickly charged back here. Also, the seats recline a bit haphazardly, but quite some way, so you can relax nice and easily in this car. And the door bins are really large. It's just a shame that there are only hard materials on the doors back here. The process of getting the 3rd row seat into place in the CR-V is simple, as I'm showing you in another shot now. You just pull the seats up, which are nice and light, from the boot, and then you can fold and tumble actually either of the sides of the back row seat. However, getting the kids in from the curb side is always going to be the safest. In terms of how much room there actually is back here, I'm a 6 foot adult, and I actually would be comfortable for about half an hour, which means that if I was a small child, I wouldn't have any concerns at all. I'll move this out of the way so you can see what's going on. My legs were up against the back of that seat back, which is pushed all the way forward. However, I do actually have headroom thanks to the high roof line of the Honda, and 2 people will be able to sit side by side without too many issues. It's impressive that there are air vents back here for the 3rd row, including with a separate fan control. You don't get that in the Skoda Kodiaq. And also the curtain airbags go all the way to the back, unlike in the 7-seat Nissan X-Trail. So in terms of thinking this through properly, Honda gets a big tick, despite the fact the CR-V is a relatively compact car in this segment, and it really shows up the larger Holden Equinox for creative packaging. The CRV VTIL, the one with the 7 seats, gets an electric tailgate as standard, and although it's certainly not the fastest door in the land, it is a trick one because it lets you set the height that you want it to open to. So if you live in a house with a relatively short garage, it means that you can set it so that the door doesn't bump itself every single time. Now, in terms of how much space there is, it's pretty impressive because even with the third row seat up, you still get 150 litres of space, which is enough to get our small suitcase in there, or a small grocery shop. It's about a Mazda MX-5's worth of boot space, even with 7 people aboard. Now, folding these back row seats is just as easy as it was putting them up. They're nice and light, and that expands the space in the boot to 472 litres. Now that is 50 litres smaller than if you got the 5-seat version, although I think that's a pretty fair trade-off. It's also possible to get a flat floor by moving this section of boot up, which means that you can actually slide your cases in and out, even though you've got the hump of those 6th and 7th seats in the way. Other than that, it's not a particularly clever boot. You don't get remote handles in order to fold down the 2nd row, nor do you get shopping bag hooks. However, the gimmick of having the 3rd row seat is probably enough for me in this car. Until you get to the Equinox LTZ model, you do have to make do with a manual tailgate, although we all used to do that in the old days, so it's probably not that big a deal. The lack of a load lip means you can slide your suitcases straight in, which is nice and easy. However, judging how much space there really is in the back of the Equinox is a bit difficult. Holden says 846 litres. That seems like an awful lot for a boot that doesn't really seem that much bigger than many of its competitors to look at. However, it is possible that they've measured above the window line, which is the usual, although not official, standard for measuring a boot. Plus, actually, if you open up the underfloor storage, there's heaps of extra space under there, which might account for why the boot literage is so massive in the Equinox. Not only is there enough space to store the load cover, there's also enough space to put in an extra soft bag under there, which is really impressive. Plus, there are 2 releases for the 60/40 folding seats that actually push the seat right the way down, which is nice and handy. However, the lack of shopping bag hooks is a bit short-sighted. Jump into the Honda CR-V and the driving experience sort of feels like Honda took an average of some of the good medium SUVs that were already on the market when the CR-V came out. The throttle response, that feels German, sort of like a Volkswagen Tiguan. The steering and the handling feels like it's aping a Hyundai Tucson, whereas the ride quality is quite supple and nice like a Mazda CX-5 on 17-inch wheels. Now, none of those things are criticisms because all of those SUVs are cars that we would consider good, and so the Honda CR-V ends up feeling like a nice, cohesive, comfortable, decent, above average medium SUV, and that's a good thing. So let's walk through those characteristics. So firstly, the engine. The CR-V is only available with one engine. The range is now completely turbocharged with a 1.5 litre 4-cylinder that makes 140 kilowatts of power and 240 Newton meters of torque. Now, there's definitely enough power available in this car. It's just in order to access it, you really do have to give the little 1.5 litre quite a thrashing. And that's characteristic of a small displacement turbocharged engine. The CR-V feels like it's strong enough around town and even on the highway, but if you want to make fast progress, you do have to be willing to sink a boot into the throttle, and of course, fuel economy will suffer if you do that. However, drive the CR-V a little more patiently, and it's definitely the most economical of this pair. We saw about 10 litres per 100 kilometres in town, and then a really impressive 6 litres flat on a long highway run. That's really good. Now, when you do wind the CR-V's engine out, it's pretty noisy, and that's because refinement in the Honda isn't the best. There's quite a lot of engine noise and road noise that are let into the cabin, and it just feels like there's less sound insulation in the CR-V than in the Equinox. Now, while the Honda doesn't have Australian-specific tuning of the dynamics, the Japanese engineers have done a pretty bang-up job making the CR-V feel good to drive. I like the steering. It's nice and consistently mid-weighted, and it feels good both around town and at higher speeds. And the ride quality is pretty good too. It does get a little bit flummoxed by very sharp edges around town, but especially on the highway, it's incredibly supple, and that means that the CR-V is a great long-distance tourer, probably the better long-distance tourer out of the two of these cars. The The gearbox is something that could be improved. So every CRV in Australia has a CVT automatic as standard, as the only option. It's not the best CVT in the game. You do have to sort of flare the throttle quite a bit in order to make progress on long hills at highway speeds. It's not as good as, say, Nissan's CVT, and we wish it was just a torque converter automatic like you get in a Mazda CX-5. A further improvement to the CRV could be found in its safety offering, because Honda Australia only applies Honda Sensing, the brand's safety suite, to the very top of the range model, and that means that the only CRV that has autonomous emergency braking, let alone adaptive cruise control or lane keep assist, is the poshest version of this car, and we think that's a problem in 2018 that AEB isn't available through the range. Jump into the Equinox, and the biggest obvious difference is just the amount of power on offer. And that's because most of the Equinox models have a much bigger engine than the only one you can get in the Honda CRV. And that's because the Holdens use a bigger 2-litre turbo, still a 4-cylinder, but it produces 188 kilowatts of power and 353 newton meters of torque, so substantially more than the 140 kilowatts and 240 newton meters in the Honda. Now, this engine is available as a 2-wheel drive, driving the front wheels, or an all-wheel drive in higher up models in the range, and we definitely recommend splurging on the all-wheel drive system, and that's simply because there's so much power on tap that actually the Equinox has a small problem with torque steer in the 2-wheel drive model, and then in the wet the whole experience can become very slippery at the front wheels very easily, and we didn't have that problem with the all-wheel drive Equinox on the very wet launch of the car in Noosa. So we think going for the LTZ all-wheel drive is probably the right idea with this car. A big benefit that the Equinox has in this comparison is that General Motors' Holden engineers have comprehensively tuned the dynamics of this car for Australia. The steering in particular feels really good for an SUV of this size. At very low speeds, perhaps it has a bit too much power assistance, but get above that, above about 40 or 50, and actually the Equinox is quite an engaging SUV to drive, and on a country road it's actually a bit of fun. The ride quality is quite distinctive in the Holden Equinox compared to the Chevrolet version of this car, because the engineers have really concentrated on body control, so the Holden version is quite a bit stiffer than the Chevy. That means that there's very little body roll, which is really impressive, and once again, combined with decent steering, it means that the Holden is actually a relatively engaging SUV to punt down a good road. However, on the highway, the firmer ride quality can be a bit more tiring than the Honda's more supple and comfortable attitude, and that's definitely something to take into account if you do longer miles in this car. Fuel economy is also another difference and is a natural product of having a bigger engine. So we saw about 12 litres per 100 kilometres in town in the Equinox with the 2-litre turbo, and then on the highway about 7 litres flat, which actually isn't bad at all. The Holden is the most refined car out of this pair as well, simply because it seems to have quite a bit more noise insulation. Road noise and engine noise are impressively low in this car, so it's nice and calming to drive, especially on longer trips. And on longer trips, you'll also appreciate the better safety fit out of the Holden. So every model, apart from the base model, has autonomous emergency braking, lane keep assist, and forward collision warning. And all of those warnings can actually be delivered through vibrations in the driver's seat, or alternatively through audible beeps, depending on what you prefer. However, you can't get adaptive cruise control on the Holden Equinox at all. It's just not something that this car is able to do. But that said, between the Honda and the Holden, it's definitely the Equinox that has the more impressive safety fit out. Like so many of our comparisons, these are two vehicles that on paper look relatively similar, but in the real world, the Holden Equinox and Honda CR-V accomplish their family transport mission in very different ways. The Equinox takes a big body and makes plenty of space for 5 people and moves them swiftly with a big turbo that makes plenty of power. The smaller CR-V is slower, but its comfy ride, high quality interior, and a 7-seat option makes it so easy to live with. In fact, in family SUVs, experience pays, and in their new CR-V, Honda has shown it knows exactly how to do a family car for 2018. Given it's also pretty cheap to buy and run, the CR-V shades the Equinox and takes home the win in this twin test.